A very warm good afternoon to everyone. I'm Sudiksha Subba, a trainee teacher of Siliguri Tarai B.Ed College, and today in this class we are going to learn about the concept of fundamental rights. Well, fundamental rights have been enumerated from Articles 12 to 35 in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution. Now, Part 3 of the Indian Constitution is also known as the Magna Carta of India. Magna Carta was a charter of rights which was issued by King John of England in 1215, and it was the first written document on fundamental rights. Now, originally we had 7 fundamental rights, but currently we have only 6 fundamental rights because one of the fundamental rights, that is the right to property, Article 31, was deleted, and it was made a legal right under Article 300A in Part 12 of the Indian Constitution by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1978. But before we begin a detailed discussion about each of these fundamental rights, let us first understand the concept of rights, the necessity of rights, why are they called fundamental, what are the importance of fundamental rights and its features in today's class. So let us begin this class with the question, what are rights? Now, rights are claims of social life. It is an entitlement, which in Hindi or in Nepali we can call it as hak, or a due or claim. For instance, right from the moment a person is born, a person has right to life, and no one can take this right from that person. But this right also has to fulfill 3 major criteria. Number 1, it has to be justified. It has to have certain value. It has to be legitimate, and it also has to be approved by the society at large. In order to understand this, let us go back to a previous example, which was the right to life. I said that everyone, from the moment a person is born, that child has the right to life, and no one can take this right away from that person, even if that person is the child's own parents who have brought the child into this world, or his immediate family members. If his parents or his family members do not like the gender of the child or any physical aspects of the child, then they cannot take life of that child. They cannot get rid of that child, because our constitution sufficiently protects the right of the child, and there are certain provisions. If they try to harm that child, they will be put behind bars. So we've understood what rights are. These are claims or dues. Now let us understand why are these rights necessary. Now, rights are necessary for leading a life of dignity. For this, let us look at the example of right to freedom and right to livelihood. Now, right to livelihood allows a person to take up any profession, trade or business or occupation to earn money for himself, which allows him to live a life of dignity. Now, how it allows him to live a life of dignity is by earning his own money. A person does not have to depend on anyone to fulfill his basic needs of food, clothing or shelter, which allows him to live a life of dignity. And rights also further enhances our well-being. Now, the right to education, the primary goal of education is always to enhance knowledge, is always to develop skills of an individual. So, education allows a person to add to his well-being by developing his knowledge, by becoming more informed and taking decisions which are more rational and informed decisions. So, rights allows us to live a life of dignity, and it allows us to live a life of well-being. Now, let us move on to the question, why are these rights called fundamental? Why not anything else? Why fundamental? Now, the word fundamental itself suggests essential. Now, we already learned that These rights are important to develop the personality of the individual. The all-round development of the individual is only possible if certain rights are given to him. Right to life is not sufficient. Allowing a person only to breathe or only to live is not sufficient. Apart from that, a state also has to give its citizens certain rights, like the right to education, right to livelihood, or right to freedom. So, the word fundamental itself suggests essential, and in fact, during a freedom struggle, one common thing which all of our leaders understood was the importance of rights. And in fact, the Motilal Nehru Committee in 1929 had already demanded for a Bill of Rights. Therefore, after independence and when the constitution was being framed, our constitution makers, they were sure of one thing, and that was to incorporate certain fundamental rights in our constitution. So they listed a group of rights and they termed it as fundamental, and they decided that these rights would be protected by the constitution. But our constitution makers not only protected our political rights by incorporating fundamental rights, but it also protected our social and economic rights by the incorporation of directive principles of state policy. Okay, now the word fundamental, we already learned that it is essential. So the word fundamental suggests that these rights, these basic rights, they are so important to us, they are so important for the development of the individual that the constitution separately listed them and they made certain provisions for their protection. Now these rights, they are basic rights which are known as fundamental rights in India, but in US they are also known as the Bill of Rights. And in fact, the chapter of fundamental rights in India, it has been hugely influenced by US constitutional fundamental rights known as the constitutional chapter of Bill of Rights. So far we've learned what are rights, why are they necessary, why are they called fundamental. Now let us understand the importance of fundamental rights and its features. Now fundamental rights are extremely important to us because it simply protects us from the arbitrary power of the state, from the unlimited power of the state. For example, during Asian Games in 1982 in Delhi, the government hired a number of contractors. Now what these contractors did was that they also hired a number of thousands of construction workers who were very poor, and they promised the construction workers to pay them certain prescribed wages. But these construction workers, they were kept in very poor conditions. They were denied housing facilities. There was no proper sanitation facilities. But they were also not given the prescribed wages which was promised to them earlier. So a group of social scientists, they observed it, they read their poor conditions, and they petitioned the Supreme Court. And they argued that employing a person to work for less than the minimum prescribed wage amounts to beggar or forced labor, which is a violation of fundamental rights against exploitation. Now the court accepted this plea or petition of the social workers, and they directed the government to ensure that the construction workers were to get their prescribed wages. So from this example, we see that two things were evidently clear. One was that there was clear violation of fundamental rights, that is, right against exploitation was clearly violated. But we also saw that the Supreme Court, it timely intervened, and that the prescribed wages were paid to the laborers or the construction workers. They were paid their prescribed wages or due wages. Now this is one of the example. It shows that fundamental rights is extremely important to us as citizens or as individuals to protect our rights. Now let us move on to the features of fundamental rights. Now one of the features of fundamental rights, we've already covered it, that is, it checks on the unlimited power of the state. It puts restrictions on the arbitrary power of the state so that it does not violate the individual rights. Now, in connection to this, the fundamental rights is available only against the arbitrariness of the state, and it is not available against the actions of the private individuals. Now further, fundamental rights are also not absolute, which means that there are certain restrictions which can be which can be imposed on them. In fact, all of the rights, they come with certain restrictions which we will learn in the preceding classes. And finally, fundamental rights, it can be suspended during emergency. And in fact, during national emergency, one of the fundamental rights, that is Article 19, it automatically it gets suspended, while there are two major articles, that is Article 21 and Article 20, which cannot be suspended even during emergency. Now this was all about the importance and features of fundamental rights. Now let us quickly recapitulate what we've learned so far. We've learned what are rights. We learned that rights are entitlement or claims or dues, and it has to fulfill three major criteria. That is, it has to be justified, it has to be legitimate, and it has to be accepted by the society at large. And we also learned why are these rights necessary. It is necessary to develop the all-round personality of the individuals, and it also helps the individual to live a life of dignity and well-being. We also learned why were these rights fundamental, why were they called fundamental, and in which I gave you an example of the freedom struggle. And then further we learn why are these fundamental rights important, in which we learned that it protects against the arbitrary power, arbitrary nature of the state, and it protects the individual rights, as we saw in our example of the Asian Games of 1982. And further we also learned about the features of the fundamental rights. So with this, we've come to the end of our class. We'll meet you in the next one. Thank you for watching.